Mr. Lionel Beer is employed by a Walt Disney Studios where he has a job catching eagles for Robert Redford's tea. He is here today to speak about his happiest time ever in his life, the high point of his life, which was the happiest time in his whole life, which was the time he saw TV chef Jamie Oliver disemboweled by a rabid baboon.
Lionel Beer.
Well, that was etymologically challenged, wasn't it? But I've got a joke for the monkey. Why do squirrels swim on their backs?
I don't know. Why do squirrels swim on their backs?
To keep their nuts dry.
Lionel, that's awful.
Right.
I expected better from you. I expected something from you.
No, that was a joke for the monkey.
Well, I suppose monkeys don't have that sort of quite a high standards of
Right, I'm down on the programme today to talk about Treacle Wells, so I'm wearing my high-vis vest. In actual fact, it got lost in the post, an envelope I sent to Jonathan saying I was actually talking about the Treacle Well, so therefore I do a quick change. And I put on my Lewis Carroll jacket. Smart, isn't it? The original Treacle Well is again topical because in 2009, the original Treacle Well is again topical because in 2009 the Walt Disney Company decided to make a film based on Alice in Wonderland. Can you all hear me okay like this? Yeah, good. Director Tim Burton wanted a bijou mansion, so the National Trust property called Anthony in Cornwall, a few miles from Plymouth's Torpoint Ferry, was a selected location. Can you just show me how to operate the buttons here? Please, who's the technical expert?
Just press.
Right. No, I wanted the one that was on up there. Yeah, but how do I do it? Oh, it's on the screen, sorry, I beg your pardon. Right, okay. That's the National Trust magazine, so as you can see they were very chuffed about the fact that a place called Anthony in Cornwall, a few miles from Plymouth's Torpoint Ferry, was a selected location. Johnny Depp is the Mad Hatter. Helena Bonham Carter, the Red Queen, and Stephen Fry voices the Cheshire Cat. Not to mention Matt Lucas doing some tweedling. Delightfully, Barbara Windsor voices the Dormouse, and an Australian newcomer, Mia Wasikowska, plays Alice. And the film was in cinemas in March this year. So, just a couple of pictures from Anthony. Oh dear. Right, when you've paid your money and go in, you're confronted with the caterpillar on the mushroom. I don't know what it looks like. Is it fairly clear from where you're watching? Okay, good. It's not so clear from where I'm looking. There's Alice and Joy. Sort of both looking as if it's the wrong time of the month. Or I shouldn't have said that, that's supposed to be Alice's house. Delightful life-size mushrooms. That's the Mad Hatter's clock, which stays the same time. So it's as in Alice in Wonderland, therefore it's correct twice a day. And it fooled me for a moment because I was sort of thinking, well, that clock's not quite right, and I sort of look at my watch, and suddenly about a couple of minutes to the hour by my watch, it came to life, and the white rabbit was sort of whizzing around the roof and popping out the sides and popping out the underneath, so it was quite a lot of fun. But what really made my afternoon was this little 8-year-old who sort of said to her parents, "That was really silly." This is the sort of rabbit hole for children to shoot down. Okay. Now, Lewis Carroll's Treacle Well, which is what I'm mainly going to talk about, is quite separate from the 60+ treacle mine locations which have sorted folklore. And these include at least 3 treacle mine public houses. The one you see up there is the one at Gray's Thurrock in Essex, which is on a major roundabout. There's another treacle mine public house down near Tadley, near the Roman town of Silchester, and there's a third one that I've been to, which is in Hereford. So there's a lot of sort of treacle mine locations around the country. But Devon's best known treacle mine is the mine at Dunchidiock, and Marcus Matthews actually drew it to my attention, and I noticed that there's a book published by CPZ, Big Cats Loose in Britain, by Marcus Matthews, and it turns out that one of his ancestors actually lived at Dunchidiock House. I'll sort of put brain in gear for a minute. Yeah, best known treacle mine in Devon. And it occurred to me so that intrepid members of the Centre for Fortean Zoology have boasted about expeditions to Outer Mongolia in search of the death worm, and to remote parts of the Gambia in search of some fabled swamp monster, or was it a sea monster, and lots of other romantic locations for long boys' weekends. So why, the great mystery is, did they never make it a few miles down the road from Exeter to investigate the treacle mine at Dunchidiock? Any CPZs sitting around who can answer that one? Nope. Anyway, this isn't any old treacle mine, and I've just come across an item in the Daily Express for Thursday. The Princess Royal at 60. It's not so much 60 things you didn't know about the Princess Royal, but 60 things about her. But the one thing they don't mention is what I'm going to talk about now. Back in 2001, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, visited Dunchidiock on Tuesday the 23rd of January. Despite the rain, which kept most of the press away, some 120 villagers and friends turned out to welcome her. After all, the last time royalty had been near the village was 200 years before, when George III came by in the early 1800s. Princess Anne was there as president of the Rural Housing Trust, which is something to do with affordable homes in small villages. And this was Devon's first such development. During her visit, Raymond Mallet, wearing his treacle mine manager's hat, presented the princess with a jar of finest Dunchidiock treacle, which she was pleased to accept. This potentially made the Dunchidiock mine a treacle mine by royal appointment. And because it was a very wet day, the tabloids missed a deliciously sticky story. And that's the lower picture is Dunchidiock House, and you can see my partner Joy in the middle, and either side there are a couple of treacle miners wearing appropriate treacle miner t-shirts. There's a strong rumour that the treacle miners assemble in the depths of winter for a treacle miners' dinner in the nearby Lord Halden Country House Hotel, which if you live in the Exeter area you probably know about. Right, now in case any of you are so misguided as to think that I'm making this up, I have here an original jar of finest done Chidiock treacle. Right, moving on. Joy can tell you that the Beer family, that's me, my family, never threw anything away. And I think we demonstrated this to Jonathan Downs when he visited us last year. He gave him one or two oddments to add to his collection of animalaria in his museum. So, quite recently, something turned up which I'd forgotten about. It was last used about 30 years ago, which was my original inspector's badge issued from Whitehall, and I have to admit that it's something that I didn't have to use very often, but I thought you might like to see it. Right. Now, moving back to the Treacle Well, when Charles Dodgson wrote the Alice stories, he was alluding to real people, animals, and faces that Alice and her sisters were familiar with. In fact, the White Rabbit may have been based on Dean Henry Liddell, Alice's father, who was often rushing about and looking at his watch. But the inspiration for the original White Rabbit can be found in Ripon Cathedral, where Dodgson's father was an archdeacon. The first, or perhaps the last, misericord in the choir has a carved rabbit underneath. When I asked what the accompanying round bit was, I was told it was a rabbit's bum going down a rabbit hole. Now, the extinct dodo was familiar to the children of the Dean, as was a stuffed one in the College Museum in Oxford. And did you know that dodos were actually larger than turkeys? Anybody know that? I've known a few turkeys in my time. Right. Now, the dodo was also a self-parody by Charles Dodgson, alias Lewis Carroll, as he often shyly introduced himself by saying, "My name is Dodo Dodgson." So hence the dodo in Alice in Wonderland. And his friend, the Reverend Duckworth, was the duck. Anyway, back in 1998, I led a Thames field trip, that's Travel and Earth Mysteries Society, to this one and only Treacle Well. And this can be found at Binsey by the River Thames, some 2 miles or so upstream and within rowing distance of the city of Oxford. In fact, Jimmy Goddard, co-founder of the Lay Hunters Club back in 1962, was with us, and he told us that the well actually lay on a significant alignment, or a ley line, if you like. The church there is dedicated, sorry, getting this wrong. But why treacle? If you look in a good dictionary, you will discover that treacle is derived from an old Middle English word, triarchal, which is actually the same in Old French. It is an old medical term for a remedy against poison, hence a sovereign remedy or cure. The word treacle in turn derives from theriaca in Latin, again an antidote for poison, which in turn derives from a similar word in ancient Greek. Thank you, Webster's Dictionary. There's a line from Chaucer, Christ, that's Jesus Christ, which to that is every harm treacle. In other words, Christ could sort the problem out for you. And a cure for poison could contain up to 70 herbs and compounds held together by honey. In medieval times, treacle could also be a healing fluid, hence a treacle well. And it was a popular diversion for Oxford students to send tourists in search of the treacle well. The Reverend Charles Ludwig Dodson and his friend the Reverend Robinson Duckworth, took the daughters of Dean Liddell on a river trip on the 4th of July 1862. The three daughters of the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, namely Lorena, who was 13, Alice, 10, and Edith, 8, clearly enjoyed Dodson's nonsense stories, and Alice persuaded him to write them down. So, chapter 13 of Alice in Wonderland is called A Mad Tea Party. Once upon a time, there were three little sisters, the Dormouse began. Their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well. What did they live on? Said Alice. They lived on treacle, said the Dormouse after thinking for a minute or two. Why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse said it was a treacle well. There's no such thing as a treacle well, said Alice angrily. But wanting to hear more, apologising, I dare say there may be one. The girls in the well were a parody of the sisters' names. Little sisters were a pun on their surname, Little, which rhymed with fiddle, riddle, whittle, if you like. The eldest, Lorena Charlotte, whose initials would have been LC, became Elsie. Lacey was an anagram of Alice, and Tilly was Edith's pet name, because I think Edith's second name was Matilda. Alice was usually the focus and hero of the stories. Now, if you believe Dodson's focus was entirely girls, then you might care to note that he had taken their elder brother Harry rowing on the River Thames, or the Isis, as it is in Oxford, and tutored him in mathematics. And in fact, Dodson, Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll, was one of 11 children, which included some 7 sisters, so you could say girls were hardly a novelty to him, unless of course he'd been intimidated by his sisters. Dodson's inspiration to the Treacle Well and Mad Hatter's Tea Party came from St Margaret's Well, which had allegedly cured an Anglo-Saxon king and was said to be good for eye complaints. The Tea Party was said to be a parody on socialism, showing that actually only the strong benefited. The 10 and 6, which has puzzled a lot of people in the Mad Hatter's hat, was apparently the living wage of a working in the clothing industry in the 1860s, and somebody sort of written a treatise on that subject, so it was included in the parodies. Poor relief, of course, included rice and treacle. The teapot may actually be a simile for hot water, and we have the Reverend Morris, sounds a little bit like Dormouse, who was a social reformer, but more importantly, he questioned Church of England doctrine. So perhaps that was the parody of him getting into hot water. Researchers talk of complex social parodies built into these fairy tales. And it was only yesterday that I noticed a connection with Clovelly, because Charles Kingsley lived in Clovelly and he wrote The Water Babies and Westward Ho. And the reason for mentioning him is that I understand that if you examine Alice in Wonderland in detail, you will actually find that he's parodied in the story. In fact, Dodson had a waspish sense of humour. He loved anagrams, codes, riddles and squibs. Who can tell me what a squib is? Roland?
I think it's some short joke.
That's close enough. Yeah, a short, witty saying, a lampoon or a satire. Anyway, Dodson used his pen as a weapon when he felt aggrieved, which seems to have been quite often. He opposed social reform, and yet, surprisingly, was a man who liked gadgets. And one of his gadgets in those days was the camera. We're talking about the 1860s, when photography was in its infancy, and he earned recognition as a good photographer, which of course would have earned him an introduction into upper class society. However, controversy arises over his photographs of young children and the fact that some of his pictures were of poor children in a state of undress. Oddly, a photo of young Alice dressed as a beggar girl actually received praise from his contemporaries. The well at Binsey was overgrown in 1857, but Dodson's friend, the Reverend Thomas Prout, decided to start clearing it when he became a curate. There was another connection with Binsey in that the girls' governess, Miss Prickett, careful how you say that, came from this village. You can still find the Prickett family name on the tombstones in St Margaret's churchyard. The church there is dedicated to St Margaret of Antioch, and in fact the pulpit has a carving of her slaying a dragon. But the church is still very much in use. In the churchyard there is a set of steps leading down to the small well, and somewhere I have a slide of Travel and Earth Mysteries members actually standing in this well. But to be honest, it's a fairly insignificant hole, and the astonishing thing is it was a major holy well for hundreds of years, with many stories of miracles and healing. And in fact, it dates back to the 8th century when Princess Friedswide, who was born about 1680, used its water to restore the sight of a Mercian prince, Prince Olgar. He had been pursuing the princess, the daughter of a Christian nobleman, as he wanted to marry her. Well, anyway, that's the polite version. Friedswide had hidden in Binsey for some 3 years, where she worked as a swineherd. Clearly, pigs must have been more high status in those days, if not actually by royal appointment. Now, Olga had been struck by lightning for his boldness with Friedswide. After regaining his sight, he left her alone and went on his way, and she was able to found her monastery in Oxford. Eventually, Friedswide became the patron saint of Oxford, and in fact, Dean Henry Liddell, Father of Alice, preached the St Friedswide sermon in Christchurch Cathedral on the saint's feast day of the 19th of October. Going back a bit, following the miracle cure, Binsey became a major place of pilgrimage. Henry VIII is known to have visited Binsley with Catherine of Aragon, and my own researchers also know that he visited the Blessed Virgin Mary Shrine at Little Walsingham, perhaps as many as 3 times. Henry was anxious to see Queen Catherine produce a surviving son and heir, and hoped that taking the water would help with this matter. It didn't. Come the Reformation, the well was closed for business and covered over. The faithful were discouraged from visiting. Now, Binsley is no more than a few farms, a popular pub, and St Margaret's Church. The Saint's Shrine can be found in Christchurch Cathedral, where it's said to be built on the site of a nunnery, and I think actually Cardinal Wolsey funded the building of Christchurch College and probably the cathedral. In 1860, a window dedicated to St Friar's Wine was commissioned by Dean Henry Liddell and painted by no lesser artist than Sir Edward Burne-Jones. The painted panels include a fanciful depiction of the Holy Well at Binsley. In 1864, Dodgson completed Alice's Adventures Underground and presented his handwritten illustrated copy to Alice. Wonderland was first published in 1865 with illustrations by Sir John Tenniel, noted for his heavy-duty, weighty political cartoons that appeared in Punch. Both Dodgson and Tenniel were fusspots, and the first edition was scrapped because Tenniel didn't like the quality of the reproductions of his drawings. But when the second edition was launched, it was an immediate success. And a facsimile edition of the original Alice's Adventures, which I've got to sort of show you something what they look like. If anybody wants to have a quick look at that afterwards, was reproduced some 20 years later in 1886. And there is a story that Queen Victoria very much enjoyed Wonderland and asked to be sent the author's next work. She was perplexed to receive a textbook called An Elementary Treatise on Determinants, all about geometry. Because of course Dodgson taught mathematics in Christchurch College. There's the dormouse getting into hot water. Don't know quite why the vegetarian magazine chose that one, but there you are. So anyway, if you find stuff about Treacle Wells and Treacle Mines a bit dull, in my spare time I go looking for granite railways on Dartmoor. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Now we have actually time for one question before I play Fast and Loose once again with the programming.
Can I have my treacle jar back, please?
Can we have... Yes, we have. Has anybody got a question? I've got a question. What's a treacle well? I missed it all. But never mind, we will get it on the video. Okay, is everybody in here? Ready? Is everybody in from outside?
Yeah, there's some person who just sat down.
Okay, can you tell Richard to be ready with our special guest? Okay, could everybody come, there's a change in the programme, and I would strongly suggest that everybody comes in here. Don't worry, there is still free cake, but you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait for about 15 minutes. In the meantime, while we're getting people in, I've known Lionel Beer for, oh God, about 20 years now, hasn't it, Lionel? Something like that. Lionel's always been a good friend of mine. He's always been a great friend of the CFZ. Last year, he gave us some fascinating biological specimens from the collection of his late father. And I've still got some books of his on loan, which will get back eventually, might be get stuff out of. And thank you for coming all this way. It's always a pleasure to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, Lionel Beer.